to the film screening plus discussion on A Strange New Beauty. I'll just do a brief introduction so we can get to the film screening as soon as possible. And following the screening, there'll be a conversation between Shelly Silver and myself, and then a general discussion and Q&A. And I think the event will end around 8:30-ish, 8:15, 8:30-ish. We'll see how the discussion goes. Just a short introduction and bio on Shelly Silver. Shelly Silver is the writer, director, and editor of A Strange New Beauty. Shelly is an artist working with the still and moving image. Her work explores contested territories between public and private, narrative and documentary, and increasingly in recent years, the watcher and the watched. She has exhibited worldwide, too many places to list here, but I'll just say a few, including at the Museum of Modern Art, Tate Modern, the Centre Pompidou, the Museum of Contemporary Art in LA, the Yokohama Museum, the London ICA, and the London and the Singapore, New York, and the London, Singapore, New York, Moscow, and Berlin film festivals. Silver has received fellowships and grants from the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the NEA, NISCA, NIFA, and the Jerome Foundation, the Japan Foundation, and Anonymous Was a Woman. That's a favorite name, I think, for me for foundations. Her recent previous films, short and long format, include The Lamp, 4 minutes and 14 seconds, and Touch, 68 minutes. She's an associate professor and director of Moving Image Visual Arts Program, School of the Arts here at Columbia University. I'm Kadambari Baxi, professor of practice at Barnard plus Columbia College's Department of Architecture. I work on architecture, media, and design research projects that circulate as exhibitions, publications, and multimedia installations. This event is part of the School of the Arts' ongoing Complex Issues series, which, reading from their description, explores difference, visibility, and representation through recent work by faculty of Columbia University and Columbia University School of the Arts in particular. Conversations invite challenging questions of racial, ethnic, gender, economic, sexual, religious, and cultural complexity. Can we think of another type of complexity? And how they're articulated across disciplines and genre today. And lastly, I wanted to thank the School of the Arts and Barnard plus Columbia Architecture Department for co-presenting this event. And personally, I would also like to thank Shelly and Gavin Browning, Director of Public Programs and Engagement at the School of the Arts here, for inviting me to join this discussion. And thank you all for attending this event. Just 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll open it up. So think of questions that you might like to ask Shelly. So let's see. So I wanted to start, I think the film has a kind of a circular logic, and so in a way I feel like let's go back to the beginning. And I think, just to remind everyone, I think you've just seen the end, and the very first text that appears in the film is in the beginning, with images of blowing tree leaves, followed by everything looks the same, smells the same, nothing tastes, looks, feels any different. But I want to go back maybe even before this beginning. Perhaps for most, that beginning is the title of the film. So I guess my question is about the title, and especially about the word beauty, and what do you mean by beauty?
Is this on?
Yes.
Great. Okay, so I didn't start making the film with the idea of beauty in the title. or in my head, but as I was filming it, I thought more and more about this concept of beauty, and there have been many definitions. I mean, I teach in an art program, aesthetic, balance, beauty is truth. Lane Gary, whose book I refer to in the film, says beauty is justice. And what I would say is beauty is really represents what we as a culture value, what we hold dear. And which led me to think of everything we see in the film, especially the architecture, the way of living, this landscape, which is, by the way, in semi-desert that we're looking at, represents our values. And then this question of where are these values leading us? This idea of beauty, yeah.
Okay. Where is it leading us?
It doesn't look good, yeah.
So I guess then my next question is, I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned the title came later. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about the process of, I mean, what brought you to this project? How did it evolve? So that's, I guess, the first part of the question. And then the second part of the question is also, maybe it has more to do, you already mentioned, kind of working, with aesthetics and the kind of aesthetic mechanisms and the kind of the structure of the film or the conceptualization of the structure of the film. So, yeah, about the process in general, yeah.
Yeah, I was invited, I guess, nominated for a residency in California, Montalvo, which is in the heart of the residential bedroom communities of Silicon Valley. And it wouldn't have been any place where I would think to make a film, but as I was asked to apply, I just thought, okay, that's an interesting opportunity. It was for 3 months over 2 or 3 years. And I went through a lot of different projects, ideas for a lot of different projects, and finally I just settled on, I'm gonna go there with the camera on a tripod, almost as if I was an alien dropped down from another planet, and just observe. So the whole film really started in observation. I would go out every day. I rented a white car. I always wore a dress, because I thought that would help me if I made people nervous. Only once the sheriff kind of showed up and pulled in front of me, but otherwise that seemed to work quite well. And just film, and as I was filming, what I noticed more and more was the absolute absence of people. And so, I mean, I do have a few shots over these 3 months of filming with people in it, but at that point I decided, okay, part of the representation of this place is that it's without people, which led me a little bit more in what could be seen as the horror film genre or the science fiction genre. But it's actually coming from the place that it's so voluptuous, the houses are so large, but it's completely underpopulated.
Right. So this was you finished in 2017?
Yes.
So you were there 2015, 16,
Yes. Yeah.
17, and I guess I'm just thinking of maybe housing crisis, etc. So I guess this is maybe a little bit after that, right? Yeah.
No, I mean, the housing crisis was increasing, and increasing, you wouldn't have a housing crisis, or you wouldn't see it from these houses.
Right.
I mean, you don't see the people who might need to move in, or even more so, the people who sometimes are there, like the gardeners, the domestic staff, the people who actually work on these houses all the time, even though, a lot of them aren't lived in at all.
Yeah, so they're, so how much of it is kind of found, you say you just got a camera and you were kind of, so is it mostly like found images in a way? I mean, you're shooting, but did you have a plan in terms of what you were going to film, or you just went to these sites? And I think there's several houses.
Oh, I mean, there are a lot of houses.
Yeah.
I went to many, many different neighborhoods, and a few of them not as incredibly wealthy as others. I mean, there's a range in in the film, although mostly they're, you know, from wealthy to wildly wealthy. And I mean, the one thing I didn't plan on was being invited in, and this happened, it was actually the road that leads to Montalvo, the residency. I was out filming with my white car, and this huge SUV pulls up, and, you know, coming from New York, and people always hassle me for filming. And I decided, you know, he came out and, oh, what are you doing? And I always said the same story. I'm doing something about architecture and landscape in Silicon Valley, which I think I am. Or that's what I thought I was doing. And I think I did, but then it expanded out a bit. And, you know, it was amazing because he said, oh, this is my parents' house, and they're gone for the weekend. And if you come back at 4, I'll give you the keys and the alarm code. And you could film till Sunday. And it's not the only time that that happened. People were incredibly trusting. And I found myself in these places that looked like they were, you know, almost like a hotel. Everything was so perfect, except maybe the closets, but, you know, just everything was out there, and I was completely paranoid because, you know, oh, they're watching me on cameras, and, you know, but it was very, very strange, the generosity of people on the one hand, and then these kind of absurd way that they live. I mean, completely absurd.
I mean, that also, you know, you mentioned that this absurdity, but you also felt like an alien, and probably, you know, a lot of people in the room being in New York, you know, or you know, maybe felt the same way watching the film. So I guess the question is, you know, to what extent this is a view of, you know, somebody who lives in the city or lives in New York. Also, I think you grew up in New York or part of the time. And maybe before you answer that, I did want to mention that I also worked on a project on Silicon Valley that was with my partner Reinhold Martin, that was about 10 years back, so this is like a little bit after this. But one of the things we were trying to, there's a series of drives, so we were kind of following 3 cities, Silicon Valley, New Delhi, and New York, and kind of following all the tech campuses and kind of urbanisms around, you know, the tech world, and I think we discussed something about that in our earlier conversation also. And one of the small diagrams, I just want to refer to it, was that we tried to track through news media how one city imagines the other. So for example, how Silicon Valley imagines New Delhi, how New Delhi imagines New York, and how New York imagines Silicon Valley, just through what was showing up in the newspaper, just through tracking the headlines. And, you know, I mean, of course, some were quite expected. I mean, you know, there's a lot more news about New York in every other newspaper media, news media. That wouldn't surprise you. But that was also just the beginning when the call centers in New Delhi and, you know, these IT companies that were now spreading around the globe were also kind of, you know, going global. And so therefore there was kind of more exposure of one city to the other, but a very specific kind of exposure. But I guess all this is to say that I'm interested in the fact that, you know, in this film, you know, your perspective as somebody who lives in New York, not just personally, but also just a city that is so very different than, you know, places like Silicon Valley, which we may or may not even call a city, but, you know, of course, it is a city in many ways.
I mean, it's interesting to think about. I did grow up my first 10 years in Brooklyn, and so this was a very urban environment, but then we moved to Long Island, and it's, you know, I mean, California is different than New York. New York should be much lusher than California just in terms of the weather, but I mean, obviously this is very lush. But I did have exposure to the suburbs, which are, I mean, I found incredibly claustrophobic. And that's something that I recognized with the bedroom communities of Silicon Valley, that you really, everybody protects themselves. Everybody, in Silicon Valley, everybody, you have to have a tennis court, you have to have your own swimming pool, you have to have your own home theater. That's like the base level of existence. And then, you know, then it gets bigger or whatever. I would say that on the one hand, the film is about suburbia and this kind of, I don't even want to say American dream, but this kind of aspirational dream of being enclosed, being safe, being surrounded by beauty, everything kind of untouched, no mark of the body. And then on the other hand, I think that, a lot of the symptoms or the disease that I'm dealing with in the film is the same, in New York. This same idea of wealth, the same idea of how much space a person needs, the same idea of unsustainability. All we have to do is look at the Manhattanville campus that's popping up all around us and saying like, okay, what exactly are our aspirations in terms of architecture as opposed to the world that one's children may grow up in without any resources whatsoever. And so, in that way, I have to say, the film is a very, I like to think it has humor, but I think it's quite an angry film and a very difficult film. And the structure, and I didn't know that it was going to be completely like this with Trump because the major editing was done before Trump, but it is based on this sort of like quiet, hit in the face, quiet goes around hit in the face, which is exactly what we experienced once Trump was in office. That's Trump's cycle.
Yeah, it was interesting because I kept noticing the gold curtains and the gold fixtures, bathroom fixtures, the gold frames, and I was wondering about, if there was any kind of reference there or.
No, there is, but I didn't do it. Yeah, I didn't do it. Everybody loves a little empire, right? That's another symptom here.
Yeah. I think the another thing that I found quite interesting, and I think we found that also, there's another kind of line in the film is, your mind is a software, program it. Mm-hmm. And that made me think about some of the work we did, which maybe is in some ways a flip side, because we were working on these, or researching the kind of tech campuses that, again, this is about 10, 15 years ago. But again, there's a kind of an interiority, whether it's living or work, because these were campuses where, they're office campuses, Google and, some of the names, but, they were the kind of workspaces that, you not only just worked, and your work environment, of course, had, couches and popcorn and, all that, but it's also where you could get your laundry done, you could go to the gym, you can go to the doctor. You didn't have to leave, this office campus. And so it was interesting, the kind of repetition of that, one way or the other. And we were, again, since we were looking at it also as a kind of a condition, a global condition, you could almost from a Silicon Valley office, you could get in a cab, go to the airport, go to the airport in New Delhi, go get in another cab, and then get into an office, so it's these continuous interiors that are spread around the globe. So I guess my question is about, and I think you mentioned you did some filming in these campuses too, but so the other side, and why did not that enter in this film, and was that, a deliberate choice?
Yeah, I filmed at Google and Facebook and Apple, but Apple, the old campus, which was really just a series of office buildings. It was an early Silicon Valley architecture. And, especially Facebook, and now the new Apple, which is shaped like a donut, it's like all enclosing. So with Facebook, you couldn't get to it. It's like you have to get in, and then once you get in, it really resembled a kind of happier Stanford college. So it really had this feeling of a college campus, not so much Columbia, but where you have everything you need. You go directly, because everybody was under 30, except for one person when I was there. That you go directly from Stanford to Facebook, and everybody's your age. You get, you have restaurants, you can sleep there. I went into the bathrooms and they're fully equipped. And then if you want to go home, you get on white buses that take you, if you're a lower level, to San Francisco, and if you're an upper level, you take your fancy car and go to one of these houses. And so it's really enclosed, and the cities and the villages were really pissed because nobody would go to businesses because they didn't need to. Like all the restaurants, there were no restaurants because there are restaurants inside. Like everything you need is there, so it just deadens everything, which is why we have to be happy that Amazon isn't coming here with their 25,000 people. So yeah, this is a really good thing. Yeah. I have one question.
No, I'm just curious, so, the choice about not, even going there, or even like one single little frame about the work life, but I mean, I think it's interesting, maybe it's this entrapment.
I decided, because watching the film, I don't know that you would know it was Silicon Valley. You would just know that it's somewhere that's very,
That's true.
like a range of wealth. And I wanted to keep it that way because I don't think this is a problem of Silicon Valley. I think it's endemic. I mean, I think it's all, and one of the regrets I had was that I couldn't find modernist architecture, and especially I couldn't be invited into modernist architecture because I think some people will look at that and it's like, oh, it's such bad taste, of course it's bad. But of course modernist architecture would be just as bad, right? But I didn't, I didn't find that range. I mean, these houses were much more ubiquitous, and the ones that were more modernist were like way back off the road, and you could just see a little right angle somewhere. But I wanted to ask you, as an architect, how do you, or if there are architects in the room, how does one navigate buildings that, I mean, because a huge amount of our carbon footprint comes from buildings, either through building or heating or air conditioning or, and how does one go forward in any ethical way?
That's a huge question. Maybe I'll defer to the architect in the room because, I'm not a building architect. I have lots of, responses. I mean, I just don't think we should be building this big. I don't think these huge houses should exist. I think for me, what's really concerning is that this model of American suburbia is now proliferating, in India, in China, because that's what, that is what everybody wants. That's the lifestyle, that's the desired lifestyle. And it's just not sustainable. It really isn't. Not everyone can have, even 2 cars and, washing machine, etc. And this is it's just not sustainable. So, I mean, I do think that architects, really, really have to take a responsibility for this and, and really kind of get on, the issues of climate change.
But this goes back to the idea of value, right, and beauty, that, I mean, all of us have to change the way we think about beauty, because if this is our idea of beauty, this will not, so I wouldn't put it just on the architects.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's a kind of wide range of guilt. Yeah.
So maybe I'll open it up. I have some other questions, but I don't want to take up all the time here. So, yes.
Hey, Shelly. I was just wondering how much of the text was written by you versus came out of dialogues, or how much dialogue you had with people in Silicon Valley, like that part of the process, and what was kind of straight from your mind or from other references or conversation.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I don't think that any of it came, I mean, I talked to people, quite a bit, but I'm not sure that any of it came directly from dialogue. I mean, there's part of it that comes out of, all the language is broken, some of it comes from advertising. There's this Acura car ad that I kind of quote, and a few of the things come from poetry. And some of it just comes out of my head, but I would say this kind of channeling, especially language used on the internet, because this was the beginning of, like, you would see those little videos and you wouldn't have to listen to it, it had all the text. Or advertising, you know, and not only television, but also print advertising, because like, you know, when it breaks into squares, sometimes I think, oh, right, it's like a real estate brochure. Yeah, yeah. So it's, the language comes from a lot of different places, even the art of war. So it's sort of this, that, and the other thing, but I wanted it all to be a little broken down, like the images, you know, not like the houses, yeah.
Well, here's a little maybe optimistic note. My cousin is a real estate broker in the North Shore of Chicago, and I went on a open house tour with her last year, and most houses were completely self-contained. This is Glencoe, Highland Park, Winnetka, Kenilworth. The house is totally self-contained. And then if you wanted more, you could get a basketball court in the sub-basement. And everything was exactly the same. It was the Cheryl Wagner faucets, and everyone had the same kind of kitchen, the same granite. It was like there was a prescription, a specification sheet of what you had to have. But the thing is, nothing is selling. So the market in North Shore, Chicago, is dead. And I happen to be looking for, I'm a real estate developer with a city planning degree from Harvard. So I was looking through, I'm doing a project in Dutchess County now, and I was looking at, you know, what's on the market. And I happened to get all the Greenwich listings. It's like everything is on the market. So there seems to be a kind of obsolescence happening in the market anyway. Now, the problem is, what we're building are these buildings that Ken Griffiths is spending $260 million to buy 3 floors in. You know, we're just building something where Uber is going to have a helicopter service where you don't even have to land. So I think the mismatch is between what people can pay for and what people really need. That's the first thing. And the second point is I'm doing a restoration of an 18th century Dutch house right now. And I really wanted to get it off the grid. It's impossible. It's in Dutchess County, it goes down to -10. You can't heat the house. It's fully insulated without fossil fuel. It's like the technology to get something completely off the grid beyond just insulating really, really well isn't there. You know, it's too expensive. It's not subsidized. It's not cost effective. So there's really, just in terms of policy, such a mismatch between what you can pay for and what you need. And what we're seeing built is what people can pay for, which doesn't really have anything to do with what they need. So I think that's what architecture schools and urban planning programs and city planning programs need to really be addressing. Like, how do you build for the future of what we need? Anyway, that's my point.
No, I mean, I think that we're completely visionless at this point, except for, Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old who went to Davos, and like, I want you to panic, right? So this was, you know, this was a great kind of line from a 16-year-old, because, I mean, I would say that my undergraduate students realize much more and are much more nervous about this.
Yeah, and so I think, speaking of that and speaking of Greta, you know, I mean, I was wondering if you consider this as an activist film.
Yeah, it's not a very useful activist film, because I think it's a little bit too experimental to to get too many people to, I mean, I think that it's interesting that, so I've made 3 films now, each of them trying to figure out where we are now. The first one was Frog Spider Hand Horse House, which was the kind of sweetest one, dealing with animals and children and really turning the camera on the people, the beings that are going to be hardest hit, you know, in very few years. Then I did A Strange New Beauty, which I think is really harsh. And Activist, I don't know, I mean, you would have to tell me if you're going to leave
Well,
here.
it's dystopian, and I feel for me, if you're
Yeah.
talking about a kind of a dystopian, world and showing that to people, and this kind of
Yeah, very
you know.
excessive and,
Yeah.
at times nauseating, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that just it's like looking in the mirror, but then seeing something else.
Right,
It's
right.
looking at every day that a certain kind of audience. But I know you've worked in Japan. Have you shown this film in Japan or other kind of really different places? And I'd just be curious what the reaction.
I did show, this summer I showed this film in Japan, and I think that there was interest. It was even more difficult though, because if you think of subtitling this, because I didn't dub it, so there's so much language, but I think that there was a lot of interest in it, but there wasn't so much discussion about dystopia. But the third film, which I just shot in Tokyo, a tiny place that is hard to touch, it's a love story that gets constantly interrupted by science fiction stories in a way to try to figure out a way forward. So like I'm trying, you can only make one, I can only make one film like this, this is, and then you have to try another path.
I think there was a question there.
Yeah, I just wanted to hear you talk about how you use sound, because it was really interesting hearing these kind of repeated scary moments that just kept being really scary, even though they were repeated. And yeah, I was just curious how you came about utilizing that.
I mean, I think how do you portray a world where everything looks perfect and yet violence is happening like off frame, and maybe in Silicon Valley maybe it's 100 miles, maybe it's 200 miles, but extreme violence and extreme ramifications in terms of climate change, especially in other countries. And so that's when I had the idea of the audio, which crept in little by little, and then I just thought, okay, let's go for it. And at a certain point also with the filming, I kept on thinking, oh, I'm filming house porn, and like I just wanted everything to look good, nice lighting, and it looks nice. But to capture the complete lack of humanity, right? And then, so the more I looked at the images, the more they really were frightening to me. Like a smart bomb went off and everybody died, and yet you still have birds and trees and somebody, that nice houses. So that's the audio. And the audio was great fun to do, I have to say. Yeah.
I mean, this, now I've seen it a couple of times, and I would encourage everyone to go back, although I don't know if they can see it. It has,
I would give a password.
Okay. Well, I mean, because it's interesting, I feel like when you see it again, maybe you project your own, kind of, because there are these disjuncts between, the image and the sound, and there's a certain kind of repetition, that there's a rhythm which is kind of hypnotic, but then it's also being broken. So I feel like, there are kind of surprises. And speaking of, you were just saying about like not having any humans, but I was definitely projecting, climate change, war, all these issues. I mean, I'm thinking particularly of this moment of the sprinklers, the watering of the lawns, and the chair, the chair, and but yeah, exactly. But then the sprinklers go off. So from I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I just you can project. I think.
And of course, there are just a lot of voices.
Yeah.
And I wanted these voices where you know, who are they, where are they coming from, do they belong there, do they not, that just sort of enter in. So the voices were really important for me to carry the language, not only the text, you know, with the different fonts.
Yeah, a different font for me, it was almost like graffiti in a way, you know, it's the kind of big fonts, and then some are like really, they're different colors, and, you know, and or even words like, you know, I think you had revolutionary,
Yeah.
visionary, you know, all these, interesting, but I think there was a question, well, a few questions, so I'm
Hello.
stop talking.
As someone who literally grew up like 10 minutes from Saratoga and has gone to friends' houses that look exactly like the ones shown, this film does feel exactly like an alien landed and started observing and noticing things that like someone like me would typically overlook, because I think one thing that characterizes Silicon Valley is its like cerebral nature, and how like instead of noticing how bland and empty things may be, there's always like more cerebral activity going on. Like that's where I don't know if I should be trying to defend these spaces for being more humane than they are, but I kind of see them as spaces for efficiency, as a place you go home to like relax for a bit, but then you go back to the school or the office, or like what preoccupies you is not necessarily based in the material aspect of every day, but more so I think in the mind. This is where I start to see like a real cultural contrast, because I mean, even the fashion taste, as you might have noticed, in that area is also extremely bland. Like, there's no weather, so you can wear a t-shirt and jeans literally every day. But then and that's different from New York, where there's like this style and all
But
of
I
that.
didn't think the spaces were bland. I mean, they were full of stuff. I mean, they were, you know, every house seemed to have its own kind of story or value system, or I don't know. I mean, it wasn't like going to an efficiency apartment, or, you know, I mean, it, you know, they're like full of stories, full of animal sculptures, full of paintings, full of tapestries.
I guess, okay, I mean, when I saw those, what I was thinking more was about how if this is where the rich people live, their taste in these kind of luxurious objects is extremely, like, not taken as seriously as the historically rich people have. Like, in the sense of, like, the Medicis, or, like even the really wealthy in New York. Like, they have a sense of taste that's more exalted than what seems to be sort of, like, watered-down reproductions of Roman sculpture or tapestry.
I mean, I grew up in a suburb, and part of it was very wealthy, and the example of Donald Trump. I mean, there's someone who's very wealthy who might make similar choices to some of that. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say, and I also wouldn't say this is all of Silicon Valley, although I did travel to many, many neighborhoods. But to get inside the houses, I only got inside of a handful. So that's another thing. I mean, I do get the sense that people, you know, it's a difference between people who overwork and they want to come back and everything be perfect. And then, you know, they hire people to make sure that it's like that. The last house with the swimming pool and the gardens. I mean, he's someone who is in cloud computing, and, you know, he has 7 houses, and he was there 2 weeks a year, and he had this huge Japanese garden, which takes so much work. Like, there were, you know, like 8 gardeners when I was there working on the Japanese garden. He looked down the hill and he said, oh yeah, you know, I haven't had time to go down there. But if he has a party, then he has to have the Japanese garden to invite people to his Japanese garden. So, you know, I think it's true that there's a different aesthetic. I guess what I feel is that we have to question all those aesthetics. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate like the kind of like observational attention to the real objects there. But then I'm thinking about how the conversations I've had with people, like, I think one of those houses could easily be that of like my friend whose dad is a Stanford professor of neuroscience. And they have a comfortable home, inviting colleagues in for dinner. But then the substance is more, I think, in the conversation than what can be materially found in the homes.
I think there's a couple of other
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
Jazz, Shelly. Having never seen this film and knowing some of your other films, and you mentioned something before where you said it was very violent, which I also felt that, whoa, where are you going here? But I also thought it was extremely seductive. And there were moments where there is the sense of the politic, but also the seduction of this idea of beauty if you're looking at prisms or something, and I thought that part was really interesting, which I don't remember it maybe in other films that you've done. And my question is more about how you understand this film relative to your other work thus up until that point.
Oh, this is a hard question.
It could be short.
Yeah, I mean, I always, there's only, I think, one other film where I split the screen. And because I always felt as soon as you you split the screen, you make it into square, 2 square, 3 squares, you're making the image into paper. So you're taking away its depth. And, so this is a big jump for me because I wanted that. And I wanted that kind of withholding so that, you have these little images, and I have to say, here it looked really nice, even little images, but, still you don't get much information and you have the feeling that it's fake, that it's repeated, that it's different angles. And then every now and then I reward people with a full screen, so you look at it, then you can enter it fully. So I would say that's different. I have made other films that have had complex soundtracks or based on other genres. The other film you haven't seen, the new film, also leans quite heavily on that. I would say it's my nastiest film, and also the film that's shot with the most distance, because a lot of my films have a lot of warmth in the view. And this one, I don't think does. It has that alien set up the tripod, get your angles right. And, I cared for everything. I really filmed it as well as I could, but always at a kind of remove. Yeah, so that's a difference. Broken language, I kind of used that before, but not to this extent, I don't think.
I guess I meant more about the approach to subject, structural approach to subject.
Well, also it's as you say, the circular approach is somewhat new, a kind of frustration. That there is kind of an arc, there are kind of scenes, but it's very hard to make a path through linearly, or certainly in terms of a narrative. It has a beginning in the beginning. It has an end. A Strange New Beauty, but then it's quite hard to predict compared to maybe some of my other films that have more of a kind of structuralist approach. That the approach, from the very beginning, okay, this is what it's gonna be like. You don't know what is in it. Yeah, I think it's this being hit over the head. That's sort of so influenced me while, my experience making it, yeah.
I'm curious, did you encounter any people of color living in any of the homes that you went to? And had I shown up with a tripod and a camera, what do you think the reaction would have been?
The demographic there is, I'm not an expert. I mean, maybe you could answer this better. It's American, Asian American, maybe Taiwanese, Indian. I don't know that there were very many people who looked like you, and I think a man may have had more difficulty, but certainly a man looking like you would have had a lot more difficulty, yeah.
The sheriff would have been there right away.
I don't know, but it's a possibility. I think also this whole you know, they didn't, it was only that one time, people were quite proud to be, you know, have their houses be filmed, which wouldn't at all be the case here. But I think as a woman in a dress, white woman, yeah. But I didn't know that when I started.
They probably thought you were a real estate agent. I don't know if this is on.
Oh, you could borrow one.
I got it. Just as, I'm a neighbor, I walked here, which was very pleasant, and this is the second event I've been at this space, and,
The first event you were in.
yeah. But, and it's great to have this beautiful theater, but I must say I fought it tooth and nail and went to Albany to fight the eminent domain move that Columbia was able to pull off on over 2,000 tenants and small businesses. But one of the things they said was that there would be cinema. That was one of the promises, like, oh, when we build this thing, we're gonna have cinema open for people, etc. And for the community. I just must say, I find it so intimidating downstairs to come into this building. I just like, I'm not to mention the fact that if there is, when the next hurricane comes, I was here for the last hurricane and this was underwater. I mean, literally, it was a lake. So, but whatever. I hope that, I just wonder what, if there's architects here, what could be done to make this place feel more, I don't know, welcoming? I don't think anyone in the, a lot of the people who live in the community might like to come here. I found it really intimidating that when I had to go through two different checkpoints downstairs, and then I'd come up here and she asked me for a ticket. And it was like, what? Maybe they're so afraid, they're sort of just testing out this new space and trying to see what the reaction is, or what they want to make sure everything is safe. But it's to me, it's really intimidating. And
How did you find out about the screening?
well, I went to the wonderful exhibit that was at the
Oh yeah,
gallery.
Posing Modernity,
And I
amazing
got the flyer,
exhibition.
which was, and was totally packed. It was really very well attended, yeah, by many, many people of color, like unbelievable. I've never been to an event at Columbia that had so many people of color. It was a glorious show, really very well done. But thank you for showing films and inviting us all.
I mean, I would say that, unfortunately for the 2,000 people that got displaced, or the 2,000, I mean, I don't know that this is any way a resource for them, because they may not be in the neighborhood any longer. But I think that Columbia really needs to know, A, how to make it more open, and B, how to program for the community better, and C, how to get the word out. Right? Although Posing Modernity really did.
Yeah, but I do think it's a question of policies, as now that this is here, I mean, there are huge problems
too
with
late.
it.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you, even but there are things like, I think actually NYU maybe used to do that, the IDs, etc., the checkpoints could be made more open, the community could maybe even have, some sort of ID that gives them, if you're living in a certain kind of, there are many, many things that can be done. But I do also want to say that, 125th Street just across is also really, has changed already, of course, but is also in really big transformation. I mean, you see even the Apollo, next to the Apollo Theater, there's that big, tall building coming up. I mean, just, running, and not just 125th Street, but north and south. And there are, this is a very difficult, I think, discussion in some ways, but I do agree that, that more needs to be done, and some are kind of simple things which can be done at policy levels.
Right.
Yeah, I think there's a question there, and I don't understand it's 8:15, so yeah.
I was interested in the woman's discussion on the second row. And it made me question, what is this, when you say strange new beauty or this taste of wealth, what is this class is this a class that's suddenly wealthy and they want to imitate the idea of wealth? Or, and, okay, my second question would be, does this wealth, this new wealth and this way of living, this retiring into suburban grandeur, then create people who are also alienated from a world that is not wealthy? So I felt two things. One is the viewer, this is homes that I never see. It's totally outside my social, whatever, life. And the people who live there, what is then their politics going to become in this kind of situation?
I mean, there were a range of houses. Actually, one of them was the director of the residency program. There were dirty dishes in her sink, and it was quite, I mean, I wouldn't mind living there, but it was, comparatively quite basic. Again, I grew up on Long Island in Great Neck, and I would say that the taste was very similar to that. I mean, it wasn't because it was X amount of years ago, and houses weren't that big, because this whole idea of 3,000, 5,000, 9,000 square foot houses is relatively recent. Of course, if you work in Silicon Valley, or even Stanford, you work in an enclosed place. And I think even worse, like Facebook or Google, the hours are incredibly long. And then you get in a car or you get in a bus, and it takes you to your, either really nice apartment or, these houses. And of course you're completely buffered, is my, you still have neighbors, although when I was out filming, like, sometimes people would come out and talk to me, and then they wouldn't necessarily know, like, the people that were right across the street. So it is, this is the symptom of now also, that, even in an urban environment where, you're surrounded by people, you're on your cell phone, so you're not really tracking.
I mean, I do think you raise an interesting question, because I often feel that, questions of race, but also questions of class, and, race combined with class, but just on its own, the questions of class are really not discussed, I think, in the public sphere. As much, I mean, we know about the inequality and of course the 1%, et cetera, and then of course that's growing, but then within that it's relative, there's so many kind of differentiation, and class, I mean, things, it enters all kinds of things like schools, education, not just where you live, and I do think that this is a conversation, it's such a critical conversation in public sphere, and as you were, I was thinking that even the word class, the way it's used in so many other parts of the world, you don't hear so much here, because you have the maybe the 1% and then the American middle class, and then the poor or the economically disadvantaged, but even that is so relative, if you look at globally, but city versus suburbs, I think the economic, access to to facilities like schools, hospitals, etc., it's very different, and it's definitely class-based. I mean, if we're talking about healthcare, So I mean, I think it's really interesting question. Thank you for bringing it up.
And of course, a lot of people, because, to us, it might look kind of homogeneous or, rich, but for them, it's really, I need to have this because my child will be in a better school, or, that it's very like looking to your next door neighbor, and they have more than me, so I better like step up to the plate. I mean, it's very, very competitive. And so even though these may look wildly wealthy, one of these houses may, talking to the people, they go, well, this is all we can afford because the house next to them is so much bigger, so much better. And so it really, and I think that that's true of all of us, especially if you think globally, right? That we think of what we need, but globally, what other people have that they survive on is wildly different. So I mean, it's all very, very relative. Starting, yeah. I mean, I would say that about myself, yeah.
So I'm feeling surprised by some of the language you're using in terms of like homogeneity, just in consumerism, just because I did feel like there was quite a bit of focus, especially in the second half of the film, on like more intimate and sentimental objects.
Mm-hmm.
And like especially moments like the dirty hair tie, like that to me was like a very humane moment. And so yeah, I guess I'm curious about like what instinct you did have to humanize some of these objects in some of these spaces, even though you feel like it's this very kind of brutal film.
I mean, maybe I think it's a brutal film in part because there are those moments. I mean, I filmed those moments when those moments were in front of me, right? I mean, most of the hairbrushes were completely clean, or everything was completely, but when I got the opportunity, like in people's closets, all of a sudden you think, oh, they do have a body, and it is wrinkled, and it smells different in here, although I couldn't portray the smell. So I was, as I said, I was really just going to film what was there. And I think that part of the thing that makes it very difficult is because you have these intimate moments, and you do have objects, like especially in the children's rooms, that are very, very, you could tell they're very cared for, they're very loved. But that's all part of the bigger picture, I think, as far as I can see it. And even if objects are loved, I don't know if that makes them more sustainable. Which is what I'm talking about, that like things really have to change. Like I'm one of these people who think like, yeah, things really have to change. Or they will change whether we want them to or not, yeah. Not to end on a
Well, okay,
bad
maybe
note.
that is a good note to end on. Change.
Yeah.
We need change.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Kadambari.